Hi, and welcome to this session titled LiveCompare for SAP, Intelligent Test Selection. I'm Tim Girouard, Senior Product Manager for LiveCompare here at Tricentis. For today's agenda, we'll first talk about identifying most at-risk SAP applications and the related test hits and gaps. Then we'll move on to detecting broken tests due to SAP Screen Changes. And then finally, we'll talk about identifying impacted SAP applications and security rules related to SAP note releases. Identifying most at-risk SAP applications and related test hits and gaps. Let's first talk about where LiveCompare fits in the Tricentis continuous testing platform. Analyze. Use LiveCompare to analyze the risk when you introduce change to your SAP environment. That change can be from SAP in the forms of support packs, enhancement packs, and upgrades, as well as your local change events in your transport or charm change request IDs. LiveCompare impact analysis is all about used objects and changed objects. I like this graphic by James Bach. From an SAP perspective, the front end is all about where the users interact with SAP. Now, changing objects happen below the front end, in the interacting subsystems and services and units. That's where oftentimes change is introduced. So it's all about connecting those change events to what at the front end level is impacted by what has changed. Changes can come in at the data dictionary level, your standard code or custom code, but they all kind of bubble up to that testable surface area. Now in SAP, that would relate to transactions, executable programs, Fiori web apps, APIs, and other interfaces. Now what about changing objects in SAP? I built this workflow to analyze SAP System 43, one of our test systems. What I wanted to do was find all of the SAP support packs that were applied in 2019. And there were 142. Those 142 SAP support packs contained over 1.1 million changed objects. And here are the top 10. Methods, reports, classes, functions are all related to ABAP code. And this table here, more likely than not, represents changes in the table definitions, the attributes change, and not necessarily the data itself, because these changes are coming from SAP. But what about your local transports? We took a look at 6 customers' transport log for a full 12 months. And what we see at the top of the list oftentimes are changes related to data and security, where you see ACGR, that's a security role change. Now, changes to ABAP are lower on the list. So report programs are down here. For this customer, we see again, table data and security roles. For customer number 3, the top change was security roles, followed by table data. Then some ABAP code here. Customer 4, more tables, more security roles. Here's some ABAP, there's some functions and programs down here as well. Customers 5 and 6, the same story. Security-related changes, data-related changes, and then ABAP a little bit lower on the top 10 list. So now we have a good idea of what we consider used and what we consider changing in SAP. Now it's all about linking your change event to the testable surface area. So here are the changes that we're introducing to our SAP environment. Now it's LiveCompare's job to go find the best test selection when it comes to used transactions, executable programs, Fiori web apps, and APIs. We took a sample size of about 15 of our customers, and what we found is they use about 3,000 used objects, of which about a third are custom. Now, when you apply an SAP support pack, that can impact many things. Like for that example that I showed previously, where we were over 100 support packs behind in 2019, we applied those. There was over 1.1 million changed objects. Now those objects impacted over 2/3 of our used transactions. We have a slight decrease in scope, but it's not enough. It's not enough of a decrease for us to roll out support packs and other change events with a higher cadence, more frequently, keeping up with more and more changes, just being more agile. And that's why LiveCompare identifies most at-risk capabilities. That way we can significantly decrease the amount of what needs to be tested in order to release the change event into production. Now, it's at this point most people ask me, well, what's the difference between impacted executables and most at risk? Well, let's say SAP changes a really common object, a real popular function module, include, BOPI, or table. Now, you may have hundreds or even thousands of executables that you use in production that call into that object that's changed, that popular function or BOPI. And instead of invoking it hundreds of different times, LiveCompare finds the best candidate that most directly invokes that change. Other factors in the algorithm include how often the executable was used in production and if it's business critical or not. So whether you test everything that's in your impacted list or most at risk, you're invoking the same changes. It's just that when you focus on the LiveCompare most at risk objects, you're using the most efficient transaction set that most directly invokes the changing objects. Once LiveCompare identifies all of your most at risk objects, it then integrates into Tosca and Qtests, and it looks for related tests. The blue here represents most at-risk objects and their related tests. So when we search the inventory of all the tests, we find a reference of that most at-risk transaction or Fiori web app. The orange indicates gaps. These are most at-risk transactions, programs, APIs, and Fiori web apps that when we search Qtests and Tosca, we could find no related test asset. Test cases that contain most at-risk objects are automatically added to the execution list. And most at-risk objects with no related test cases are automatically populated to a folder within requirements. LiveCompare stores most at-risk objects along with their test covered status on the LiveCompare server, and this will give you historical trends, like this gap trend analysis. Here we see 7 months. Let's say we implemented LiveCompare back in August, and at that time, of the 73 most at-risk objects identified, only 10 had related test cases. The other 63, represented in blue, are gaps. Now we see the gaps trending down. In fact, the latest month, there are only 24 gaps, which means that we're starting to build more and more test cases based on transactions that we use in production. They're business critical. They're getting impacted and most at risk by our change events. And they're definitely ones that we should consider building test assets for. So in summary, for every change event in SAP, run LiveCompare impact analysis. Find your hits, which get populated into your execution list, and identify those gaps, which will then be part of your requirements. And you can address those gaps using ARA and Tosca and your execution on DEX. And then finally, you can run test audit to make sure that all of those most at-risk objects have been tested. Here's a screenshot of what the test audit analysis looks like. Green represents executables, most at-risk executables that have a passed test status. Red have a failure, and gray represent tests that have not been executed. Okay, let's log into LiveCompare for a demo. Starting from the consumer home screen, you can filter the apps by DevOps teams. You'll find Smart Impact and Testing. Choose a new variant. Enter a name. Open your variant and choose your parameters. In Smart Impact, there are 3 groups of parameters: objects to be analyzed, SAP systems to connect to, and parameters related to your test repositories, like Qtest and Tosca. Objects to analyze can be contained in transports or charm change requests. Use the transports parameter for your local transports as well as SAP support packs. The charm change request parameter is a popular option for those using Solution Manager Charm to manage transports. The object parameter allows you to analyze the impact of an object even before you change it. The next group of parameters I'd like to talk about are your SAP system selections. The analysis system is the system with the change, usually development, or a sandbox. The SAP Solution Manager system is the one that has your charm change requests in it, if you use that option. Performance History System is a system that tracks what transactions, programs, web applications, APIs, and security roles that you're using. This will be your production system. The comparison system is a system you can compare your analysis system against if you wish. This will give you a better understanding of how the changing objects changed. This system is usually a QA, a pre-prod, or a production. And finally, you have your test repository parameters. I'll choose Qtest and leave the search wide open. The Create Test execution will place all of the most at-risk related test plans in a folder within your execution list. You can now run or save your variant. If you choose to unlock your variant, other users in your project can see it, and they'll be able to edit and run it as well. Click Run and you'll see your results on the right-hand side. The dashboard text tiles indicate we analyzed a bundle of transports on March 25th within ECC Development Client 110. Our Use SAP Applications performance history is from ECC Production, and we have 3 years of history collected on the LiveCompare server. And for this analysis, our test integration is with the Qtest Golden project. The transports analyzed contain mostly ABAP-related objects, with some configuration, data, and security-related changes as well. Structures and table definitions were the most common changed object types. These changes impacted 130 SAP transactions, of which 22 are most at risk. Web applications, including Fiori, programs, smart forms, APIs, and security-related objects were also identified as impacted and most at risk. When we look at these most at-risk objects and their related test coverage status within the Qtest Golden project, we see we have some work to do if we want to achieve more coverage in our continuous testing platform, especially with our APIs. Before we move on to the Smart Impact Analysis details, I want to take a moment to point out the help sheet, where you can learn about the differences between impacted and most at-risk objects, as well as terms like business critical and depth. The first column is the change ID, which will be the transports or the charm IDs that were analyzed. Child type and name are the changing objects contained in the transports. The child name hyperlink provides visibility on how the object changed. There are 4 types of change you can filter by: ABAP, configuration, data, and security. The Use SAP applications that invoke the changing object can be seen by double-clicking on the impacted object's value. Now we're on the impacted object sheet, filtered by the changing object. In this example table, STXB has changed. At a depth of 5, it is invoked by VA01, the Create Sales Order T-code. VA01 has many DIMPRO screens. The specific screen impacted is the Sales Document Initial screen. Excel does not have a go back feature, so to get back to where we just were, just click on the impacted object sheet. VA01 was used in production 146,000 times by 13 different users. The top user is this LC user account. There are 21 related tests. Here are the test IDs, names, and paths. VA01 is in the Sales and Distribution Application area, the VA Dev class. It is not a custom object, but it is business critical and most at risk. To view only most at risk objects, select the spreadsheet, click Data, clear Filter, and then select Y in the most at risk column. Okay, on to part 2 of this presentation, detecting broken tests due to SAP Screen Changes. Going back to this graphic by James Bach. Okay, at the top of the graphic you see the front end. Now, when SAP makes changes to screens, that impacts the user's UI with the SAP front end. Now, LiveCompare Smart Impact Analysis will support screen changes in support packs and transports. In other words, if SAP changes a screen or if you change a screen locally, LiveCompare will still find your impacted and most at-risk transactions that screen belongs to. And it will also find the related test assets in Tosca and QTest. But we also recently introduced another app called Heal Tests. And because in Tosca, SAP SAP screens are now captured within properties of modules, we can take that information and select two SAP environments, compare them, and tell you what screens have changed, what screens are now broken, and the UI will need to be rescanned. So when we detect broken screens, we automatically populate a SIC modules folder. So the SIC modules will contain all of the modules that have screen differences. And then for test cases, we automatically populate a SIC test cases folder. Now to run Heal Test, it's super easy. Log into LiveCompare. Filter your apps by testing and select Heal Tests. Create a new variant. Choose your test repository, your source system, now maybe this is production, and your comparison system, and maybe this is a recent copy of production that you've upgraded. You can then identify your root paths and hit run. At this time, I'd like to play a recorded demo for you that takes it a little bit further. Let's say this graphic represents your SAP production instance, where you're a full year behind on applying any type of support pack. Now let's make a copy of production and apply the support stack upgrade. Using LiveCompare, we can now understand how disruptive changes to your business processes. In this demonstration, I'll use this LiveCompare workflow to discover change impacting my top used applications. The first action in this workflow retrieves all of my used transactions, Fiori web apps, programs, and APIs. In this example, I'll select the top 5 used transactions. My Create Sales Order transaction, VA01, ranks number 4. Next, I'll select my Copy of Production RFC and my Production RFC and retrieve all of the SAP components that make up my top 5 transactions. The next step is to compare the components, and I now have a distinct list of screen changes. Here are the screen names for FI01, and these belong to VA01. Let's have a look at the details. I'll select screen 4900 related to VA01. Notice the attribute differences between our upgraded pre-prod versus production. The upgrade caused a decrease in field length, an icon name change, and an upper lowercase configuration change. The System 2 icon indicates a field that's in production but not pre-prod, which means that this upgrade removed the exchange rate field. LiveCompare did a great job at identifying the screen changes due to the support pack upgrade. But just because the screens are different doesn't necessarily mean that my order to cash process is broken. It's true that VA01 is heavily used in this example, but VA01 has hundreds of screens, and no one uses them all. The most important part of this demonstration is to discover if any of these 28 different screens are related to our Tosca test cases. Tosca captures SAP screen information as properties within modules, and you can run LiveCompare anytime and identify test cases that contain modules with SAP Screen Changes. Go to the LiveCompare homepage, select the Heal Test app, create a new variant. Select a Tosca project within the test repository dropdown. Select a source system. I'll choose Development. Then select a QA system for the comparison. And finally, define your project's root paths, and then click Run. The next time you're in Tosca, you'll notice a folder within your modules. This folder contains all of the modules that have SAP Screen Changes. There will also be a folder in Test Cases, containing all of the tests with affected modules. Tosca's model-based test automation provides excellent resilience to changes in the UI of applications. And now with LiveCompare, damaged modules and test cases are detected at the earliest point in the release cycle, giving test teams the maximum time to rescan the UI and automatically update dependent test cases. The third and final topic in our agenda today is identifying impacted SAP applications and security roles related to SAP Note releases. Sometimes when you apply an SAP Note, it contains an object. And within that object, there can be some security authorization impacts. For example, a customer recently approached us and said, when we applied this S-Note, this note from SAP, it contained a function module. And within that function module, there was an authority check object with some changes to some activities related to an authorization object. So the issue was, it added or removed authorization in that functionality. So this customer wanted to know the transactions that interact with that function module, as well as their related roles and the folks or the accounts that are executing those transactions. So that's what the authorization note impact analysis is all about. And you can see on the graphic on the right-hand side, changes in the middle. And what LiveCompare does is it identifies impacted SAP applications. Those are all of those objects at the testable surface area. The impacted roles, the roles that contain those impacted transactions and other objects related to the testable surface area, as well as the impacted users, the group of accounts that are executing those impacted transactions. Here's an example of the results. The first column is the transport. Now this is the transport that contains the S-Note change. The second and third columns represent the changing object. And there happens to be about a half a dozen functions there. We can see some of them repeating themselves, like that first one. It's repeating itself because if you look at that last column, there are actually 2 authority check object changes. And you can see them listed there. Now, impacted objects, those are the objects at the testable surface area that invoke the changing function module. Let's bring up the spreadsheet for a demo. Okay, so here's the transport that contained the S-Note. And the S-Note is all related to these function modules. So this function module has 2 changes, these 2 authority check objects. And what's nice about this report is it contains these hyperlinks. So I can click on this hyperlink and actually see side by side the code. So what the S-Note did to an environment where this S-Note is applied on the left-hand side versus maybe a copy of production or a QA box on the right-hand side. So you can navigate to all these different changes and actually look at the security change and the different activity levels or whatever the change is related to the S-Note. Impacted objects. So if you double click here, I'll see the 33 impacted executables. So the first 2 columns again are the changing function module, and then type and name. This is the type and name of the object at the testable surface area in SAP. For example, transaction T-code ME33 has 1 impacted user. So I can double click here, and here's the user that's executing ME33. In fact, they've executed it 31 times in production. It also tells me the impacted role. ME33 is assigned to this SAP EPM Plant Manager role. So going back to our graphic, it's all about connecting change to the impacted applications, roles, and users. So that concludes the 3 topics on today's agenda. I would now like to open it up for questions. Okay, the first question. Can you go into more details about the differences between impacted and most at risk? Yes, for that I'd like to use these graphics here. Okay, starting on the left. Business criticality, dependency chain, and usage all equates to risk in the LiveCompare most at risk algorithm. SAP objects that are business critical are automatically assigned most at risk status if they are impacted in any way, regardless of how much they're used or how far away the change is. So for example, let's say you run some finance report at the end of the year. So the usage isn't very high, but it's business critical. It's critical to year-end reporting. Let's say also that the change that is being introduced is pretty far away from that year-end report. So looking at JM-Box graphic, the year-end report would be on the front end. It's only used, say, once or twice a year, and the change is way low, like in this units level maybe. Well, because it's impacted, we're still going to put it on the top of the list to prioritize. It's going to be assigned most at-risk status. So anything with business criticality is automatically assigned most at risk, regardless of how much it's used or how far away the change event is from that executable. For all other non-business critical functionalities, we then look at dependency chain analysis and usage, so depth and usage. So if you look at the front end of you say you're at the transactional level, if your transaction directly invokes the change at a depth of, say, 1, meaning an executable program directly calling into a function module or include, that's going to score high. Whereas that same function module include can be pretty deep when it relates to other front-end executables. So we're going to always favor transactions or anything at the testable surface area that directly invokes the changing object. And when there's a tie, let's say you have 15 transactions that all invoke the same change at a depth 1. For the tiebreaker, we look at usage. Okay, which one is used more in production? And that's the one that gets assigned most at risk. I also like to show a quick demo to kind of relate it to some real SAP objects. So let's log into SAP. Let's say we want to run Smart Impact, not on a transport, not on a charm change request, but on a specific object. We can do that by identifying the object here. So I want to analyze this BOPI called Goods Movement Create. And when I do that, there's only one changing object. So I expect to see maybe one most at-risk executable. So let's take a look at the results. So here's the changing object. It's that function module. It impacts 12 transactions, and we assign 2 most at risk. So there's actually 2 winners for the T code that get assigned that most at risk status. 10 executable programs were also impacted, and one of them is assigned most at risk status. So going into impacted objects, we can see a little bit more details. The first 2 columns represent that changing function module that we analyzed. And we see the most at-risk winner at the very top. And I know that it's most at risk by looking at the last column. Most at risk, yes. And so why did this program display document flow, why was that assigned most at risk and not the other executables? Well, it's all about the depth, because this program at the testable surface area calls into this BOPI at a depth of 4. So it's not too far away. Whereas every other executable calls it at a depth of 5 or 7 or 8. So it's further away. Now, the further away the change is to the executable, the less likely you're going to invoke it in your day-to-day business processes. If it's a direct depth of 1, yeah, you're always going to invoke it because you're always passing through that object to get to other objects. But the deeper you go, the less likely you're going to interact with it in your day-to-day activities. And that's why we decided that this program is the best to test this particular function. Now, if there were multiple depth 4s, we then look at the usage, and the usage would determine the most at risk. So if you look at all these depth of 5s here, all these T codes, so these are all transactions impacted by this function module, and these are sorted descending by usage. So the next runner-up in terms of most at risk would be this transaction here. In fact, there's a setting within Smart Impact Analysis called threshold, where you can allocate a certain percentage of impacted executables as most at risk. And when we do that, when LiveCompare does that, it looks at the next best candidate to test. And this change production order would definitely be the next one. Now, some folks just like to see one most at risk winner, and other folks might want to bump up that threshold, so we include more test coverage around that single changing function. If we look at there's 2 other most at risk executables here at the bottom, and their depth is pretty high, 7 and 8. So why did they become most at risk? And the reason those are most at risk is because VA01, create sales order, and ME20, stock monitoring, they're both business critical transactions. So like I said before, if your transaction or whatever your executable is, if it's assigned business criticality, it automatically gets assigned most at risk status if it's impacted in any way, regardless of usage and regardless of depth. So a lot of folks will sort or filter this report by most at risk, and then make sure that they have some test assets to cover those most at risk executables. So I can see that I have one test for ME20. I just double click here. Here's my test. Here's where it belongs in Tosca. If I follow down this path, I will see my test that covers this most at risk transaction. Now, what about gaps? So this executable program for display document flow does not have a test hit. In that case, we can go to the top user and find, well, who's the top user to execute that particular program, and maybe that user can provide us some guidance on how to create the test case. In fact, we recommend top users, if they're subject matter experts in their area, they can run the Tricentis ARA tool, to record the scenario in which the executable program happens to be. Okay, hope that answers the question regarding most at risk versus impacted. Okay, the next question is, how does LiveCompare determine which transactions in SAP are business critical? Okay, in LiveCompare, if you have studio access, you can go into the studio, expand data, expand external data sources, and select business critical objects. So this is where you can manually add and remove what you consider business critical, or what the customer considers business critical in their own environment. There's going to be custom transactions and reports that we would not be able to have any kind of filter or determination or any kind of selection criteria. So every customer has their own set of business critical objects that they manually identify and load here. So let me show you some sample. So I have all of these transactions on my my test machine that I put in here because I think they're business critical. So going back to that last example, let's say you're expecting to see CO13 as most at risk because that's this cancel confirmation of production order is business critical. So what you would do if this is a business critical transaction is go back into LiveCompare, and we're just going to add another T code, CO13. Click Save. And replace your business critical and update your business critical objects file. And the next time you run Smart Impact, there will be a fourth object as business critical. It would be this one here. You'll see a Y in the most at risk column. Okay, the next question. In my results, there is a program listed as most at risk. We don't test programs here. How do we ignore programs from ending up in our smart impact analysis results? Okay, let's go back into our results. This program here was most at risk, and if we're not going to test this and never will, we can add it to the ignore file. Let's copy the program, go back into LiveCompare. Under Data, External Data Sources, go down to the bottom and select Used Objects to Ignore. And you can just add the program here. The type would be PROG, and you'd paste in the program into this file, and then once you saved your edits, replace the data file. Very similar to the process for adding objects to the business critical object list. Now, the second thing you can do is, if you have admin access in LiveCompare 4.1, you can expand administration, configuration, and then impact analysis. And then here you can select or unselect any of these types here. So if you're never going to test programs or smart forms or web applications, iDocs functions. Functions are related to APIs, and classes are too. Classes are a lot of web services will invoke classes. But if you're strictly focused on T codes, from an administrative perspective, you can select T codes here, and then you'll never see programs in your results here. Okay, I think those are all of the questions. That's all we have for today. I hope this was informative for you and you enjoyed the presentation. If there's any questions, please don't hesitate. You can reach out to me anytime, and we can take a deeper dive into LiveCompare. Thanks a lot. Take care.